Hi, this is Paul. At the end of the Mark Driscoll, Nadia Bolz-Weber video, I mentioned this question that Julian asked me: is Christianity revolutionary? And so I don't know how little this video will be, but I sketched some things out because it's a good question. And I completely understand why someone like Julian, who's a Hutterite, one of the very serious, credible traditions in the Anabaptist segment of the Radical Reformation, would have some tensions with how Jonathan Pageau is sort of laying things out. Even so, I wanted to make a little video about how to answer this question, because it's not exactly yes or no. So let's begin with Christine Hayes's treatment of the Hebrew Bible on YouTube. I mentioned this in the question and answer. I mentioned it in a few other videos. I might take a look at some of these videos a little bit more deeply, but I wanted to just go over a few things because I think this is something that some of you have seen already. It was recommended to me by others. I talked to Jacob, and Jacob seemed to like it. And even though her approach doesn't necessarily sync with Jacob's approach or my approach, and certainly not Jonathan Pageau's approach, there's a lot of worthwhile stuff in this series. Hayes lays out a nice middle-of-the-road, modernistic, secularist view of the Hebrew Bible to her class at Yale. And so if I do any video commentating on this season, I'll probably do something to sort of illuminate and bring to the surface a lot of what's implicit in her presentation, in her presuppositions and her decisions about what goes into it. But in any case, you can learn a lot from this. And what's not well examined in the course are her presuppositions, which are behind the class. Those are implicit. And so if I do any work on that, I'll probably do some work in that area. Now, of course, the Hebrew Scriptures begin with Genesis 1, and Genesis 1 lays out the world, and it is good. And, of course, you can read Jonathan Pageau's brother's book, The Language of Creation, to get a sense of what Jonathan and Mathieu are doing with that. But the world is laid out, and it's good, Genesis 1 and 2. Now, of course, Genesis 2, 3, and following, problems begin to arise in the world. The serpent tempts the man and the woman to partake of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They are exiled from the garden, cursed. The ground and the womb and the serpent are all cursed. There's murder between the first two brothers. The world becomes filled with violence, sort of weeds among the wheat. And there's a flood which sort of wipes the slate clean, and it gets reset. But then it seems to follow the same pattern again. And so God launches a new plan with Abraham as sort of a new reset. Now, you get to the book of Deuteronomy, and you have a fairly karmic approach to the relationship between God and Israel. If you read chapter 28, if you obey the commands and are faithful to the covenant, then God will bless you. If you disobey the covenant, God will curse you. And Christine Hayes lays all of this stuff out. God rescues Israel from Egypt. If Israel obeys the covenant, she'll be blessed. If Israel disobeys the covenant, she'll be cursed. Now, one of the things to know about her treatment is she leans pretty heavily, as do many modernist scholars today, on the documentary hypothesis. And what that does is sees beneath the text and behind the text the conversations between, now we don't have any other evidence of these conversations besides sort of trying to read the text carefully, try to get behind the text. They read tensions between different communities and different belief systems. In the second chapter, in the second class, she lays out the work of Ezekiel Kaufman in his book, and some of the tensions that I've talked about here between the meta-divine realm and sort of default paganism in Israel. And she sees that all along the course. She'll go into all of these various, the J source, the P source, the Deuteronomist. She'll go into all of these things, try to get behind the text, find out the date, why did the text arise as it did. Now I could go into a long talk about why she does that, but that's all sort of built into trying to approach the Bible as a science. It's very much built into the modernist frame of trying to say, well, we're not going to, it's very much post-Enlightenment. We're not going to necessarily hear God through the text. We'll hear the voices of these people of faith and what they believe and so on and so forth. It's very much a modernist approach to the text, very much the kind of thing you'll find in liberal Jewish or Christian commentaries on the text. And that has become sort of the secular approach to Bible study. This is an approach that Jonathan Pageau doesn't have any patience with and regularly denounces. And that approach has sort of fallen on hard times in many communities, partly because it became rather antiseptic and sterile. And she'll talk about that too, but yet nevertheless, in a place like Yale, she's sort of bound to use that as the content of the course and the treatment of the text. One of the things that you see, though, and I think she nicely lays out the tension between Ezekiel Kaufman's view of, well, what the text is bringing is a very new perspective on the world from sort of classic paganism around. Now, what they'll see is that there are remnants of classic paganism in the text, which are not necessarily rooted out by these redactors, but they're struggling with the question of what's wrong with the world. Because again, in Genesis 1, everything is good, and then things start to go bad. So how can we deal with the presence of evil, the presence of wrong, the presence of suffering, the presence of death? How do we explain this? How do we explain this in light of an all-powerful God instead of a meta-divine realm, which is just sort of out there, and there's all these other gods and powers and forces that are at play? So she brings into this course, and she does this in the first couple of lessons, the tensions between Ezekiel Kaufman's perspective and what she sees as all of this other history beneath and behind the text. Because as a modernist, she's sort of reading the text from above, dispassionate, scientific, from a monarchical vision, looking at the text, not really necessarily living through the text, even though people in the story are using the text and living through the text. And these various communities, the various sources, will have their different competing ideas as to what's wrong with the world and what to do to make the world right and live successfully in the world. So older voices that are pre-Israelite, so she'll differentiate quite early on the course of basically assuming that, and this via archaeology, that there's a lot of Israelites that are sort of living in the land sort of as pagans, and then that there are other priestly class and other groups that are trying to convince them that the Lord is the only God and they should follow and worship them. And there's this struggle for Israel, and there's the assumption that, well, the tellers of the story of Israel are sort of, telling it in a managed way. And so you have sort of Israelite religion that comes through the Bible, and then how things were practiced on the ground. And that, of course, gets into all these questions of historiography, so on and so forth. So you have older voices that are sort of pre-Israelite religion and resisting Ezekiel Kaufman's thesis. And those would be sort of work your sacrifices to make your way in the world, find favor with the gods, and it's basic paganism, but sort of with Israelite gods and happening in Israel and maybe some tweaked Israelite ways. And now this isn't a unbiblical hypothesis in many ways, because if you read the book of Judges, you'll see that this is the struggle with the high places, the struggle to centralize the sacrifice in Jerusalem, the building of the temple. She goes into all that stuff. And I think, again, it's a good treatment, again, from sort of this modernist scientific approach to the Bible. Along, though, of course, comes the Deuteronomist, who has this question, well, why isn't Israel flourishing? Well, she's not following the terms of the covenant. And if Israel would only obey, then everything would turn out right. And these tensions remain in the community, and they remain in the community all the way into the Second Temple period, into the time of Jesus, because those are still the tensions that you can hear happening in the background around Jesus' ministry. And we know this from, these tensions continue on. And so it's all about obedience to the Torah. It's about obedience to the law. And if we would only fulfill the law, then God would bless us. And the reasons we suffer is that God is punishing us and he's refining us. And of course, this comes full blown in the time of the exile. Now, she sort of reveals her hand a little bit more when she deals with the book of Job, because a lot of these tensions come into play in the book of Job. And the book of Job is one of the most interesting books in the Hebrew Bible. And the book of Job in some ways sort of throws a wrench into a lot of this, because the book is very old, but where's the redactor? And, so they've got all of these debates. But modern secularists who are skeptical about God and the efficacy of relating to God, they like the book of Job often and the book of Ecclesiastes, because it seems to speak to their agnosticism and to sort of leaving the mystery open that, well, unlike the Deuteronomist, we can't come to these firm conclusions about why God does what he does. Because Job is a righteous man who suffers through no fault of his own, and people come in with their pre-cooked theological suspicions, and in the end, the book of Job says, no, God does what he wants. And of course, you had this other frame around the book of Job, where they're dealing with issues of, do the righteous only serve because it pays? And again, it's a very interesting treatment of the book of Job. And this is, and seems to be in many ways, a favorite book of hers, and where she herself seems to find how this, she finds wisdom, and this very much connects with her. So they find in Job sort of a deconstructed skepticism that they find vaguely inspiring. I tend to find it religiously pointless. Now, if you go back and you look at I've got a lot of dislikes on my conversation with Nate. That was kind of interesting. My conversation with Nate, I sort of laid out something. One of the interesting aspects about Jordan Peterson is that he comes down on the idea that it seems to be pragmatically beneficial in this world to begin to act as if being is good, and to try to negotiate with being and act as if being is good. And he doesn't say it as such, but in many ways, this is sort of the foundation of what will become Judaism and Christianity, that being is good and being can be negotiated with. Now, the meta-divine realm basically says being is neutral, and that's sort of the stance of paganism, that, well, there are good and evil actors in the world, and we should please placate, indulge, use spiritual powers in order to make our way in the world. And this very much connects up with current naturalism, where being is neutral, and you're left with physical power to deal with chaos, whereas the ancients used spiritual power to try to deal with chaos. We're skeptical about that, so it's up to us to save the world, to make our way in the world. It all depends on what human beings do. It's the moral value of being. Now, you get to the book of Daniel, and things get a little special in the Hebrew scriptures. And of course, there's all this debate about the dating of the book of Daniel. Is it 6th century? Is it 2nd century? And I'm not going to wade into any of that. But it's apocalyptic. And evil is vivid with these, especially in the second part of Daniel, where these sea creatures come out of the sea. The first part, you have all these ordeals, and Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are vindicated by their faithfulness to Torah and the law. But then you get into what some might call 2nd Daniel, chapter 7 and following, where you have all these apocalyptic visions. And I think she does a nice treatment on the apocalyptic genre. But in the context, all of these new ideas seem to get introduced. You have the introduction of the resurrection. You have these evil principalities and powers that you don't really find as such in the rest of the Hebrew scriptures. And so what we're seeing is that, and then when we come to the Second Temple period, when we come to the stories of Jesus, we're going to find all of this stuff full blown, not just in terms of Jesus and his disciples, but also in terms of the Jewish community around Jesus, that these ideas that obviously get expressed through Daniel are manifest in the community around them and get played out in both Jewish and eventually Christian literature. And in some ways, this shows in some ways sort of an open door to the issues that the broader pagan populations are dealing with. But the Jews are going to deal with it sort of in their own special way, because their presuppositions and their foundations are very much set on these Hebrew scriptures and by the prophets. And so we're going to find some ambiguities and sort of two-track systems in answering some of these basic questions. If you're talking to someone who is deeply set in what Ezekiel Kaufman describes, you tend to get one kind of answer. If you're talking to someone who has sort of a vivid picture of a lot of the stuff that comes through Daniel, principalities and powers and evil and all of that, you tend to get another set of answers. So in other words, in the New Testament sort of takes on sort of a two-track system in dealing with not just a universe which is filled with God, not a metadivine realm, a good God, and you're going to have to deal then with those kinds of questions. So in many ways, what the New Testament does is become sort of an interpretive guide to the Old Testament and takes some of these ideas and reads them back onto, or I might better say reads through those interpretive lenses into it. And so this is where we see sort of subtle readings. If you read, for example, Genesis 1 and Tanakh, you'll see wind. Christians will usually read back spirit. And so you have all these kinds of things that have been discussed between Christians and Jews, and the complaint about from Jews, which I completely understand, is that Christians read back onto the Old Testament the elements of the New. Well, that's because Jesus and then eventually the apostles become an interpretive key for the others, whereas rabbinic Phariseeism will become an interpretive key. We never read an ancient text without some degree using some interpretive keys to bridge the world. So what we find is Satan is a powerful opponent. And so Christians will see in Genesis 3, they'll start connecting the serpent with Satan. And someone might say, well, that's sort of an anachronism. That reading comes later. Yes, it does. It doesn't mean it's a bad one. It's quite ironic watching people get very fussy about certain anachronisms, but then sort of wipe the whole way of reading away by contemporary standards, which we're always going to have our anachronisms with us. It's just helpful to have an understanding of when we're doing it. So Satan is a powerful opponent, but by no means equal. And the stories between Jesus and Satan make that very clear. I love how in the temptations, Satan basically tempts him a third time, and Jesus basically says, get lost. And he has to go. I mean, Jesus is that powerful. And you have that in many other stories of Jesus. So Satan is shown as a powerful opponent, but by no means Jesus equal. So it's not a dualism. And in this way, they're working through the tensions between what you find in the older texts in the Old Testament and now what they're seeing then in the New Testament. The world is under the shadow of rebellious principalities and powers. Okay, what are we talking about? Is Christianity revolutionary? Well, in the New Testament, there's the present evil age, and there's the spirit of the age. And you'll find this in the Apostle Paul, and you'll find this in the Gospels, and all of these exorcisms that Jesus does bear manifest to this and the inbreaking of the kingdom of God. These powers have revolted against God's rule. This is an explanation for the way the world works, or in fact doesn't work, why there's evil, why there's suffering. And this sets up Jesus as a liberator. And I would use liberator instead of revolutionary because, of course, Jesus is the Son of God. He is the true regime who is going to take legitimate power. And this is what really sets up Jonathan Pageau's take, and I think his best video, Parasitic Storytelling, that there is a structure, there is an order, and Jesus brings restoration. And this, not to play too much Protestant football here, this is basically a very old Reformed reading. Jesus restores the kingdom in many ways, and then some. And then, we can get into questions of how Jesus not only brings us liberation, but then Jesus also goes further and, new things happen. So principalities and powers that rule the world are in revolt against the earth's true ruler. C.S. Lewis lays this out quite nicely in Mere Christianity. Jesus defeats these principalities and powers and leads them in triumphal procession, a la the Apostle Paul. This was a very, very early, and you look at early and late in the New Testament, this seemed to be a very, very early theme, because by the time Paul is writing about it, fairly early, already in the 50s, there are already songs that Paul seems to be appropriating and putting them into the text. So very, very early these ideas happened. This sort of mitigates against this idea that all this legendary stuff appeared slowly in the New Testament was developed. No, my reading of it is that it's in fact very early, and these themes flow very easily out of all the stuff that was happening in the intertestamental period, all the way up to when, in a sense, the Bible opens up, and there you're reading in the Gospels all of this development from the book of Daniel. Now, there are multiple images and conversations that come along through the text, and you can find that in the debates of theories of atonement. There are tensions between the integration of the Old and New covenants. Substitutionary atonement, I think, tends to be favored among, let's say, the Reformed. The Reformed tend to really love reading the Hebrew Scriptures, and substitutionary atonement minimizes some of the newer demonic elements in the story. And the deeper you go into modernity, I think in some ways the stronger it gets. And that's why you see in the case of some Reformed theologians really an almost exclusive love of substitutionary atonement. But it's quite clear from the New Testament that the Christus Victor themes are well embedded and very much embraced by the New Testament writers. And they play very well in cultures where demonic powers are salient. And this, I think, is part of the reason Christianity has been so effective in going all over the world, because what Christianity does is has this capacity to engage pagans in sort of within their own frame and give an intelligible understanding of evil and salvation and all of these aspects that Christianity brings to the pagan world. And I think that's part of, what begins in the book of Daniel, gets worked through then in the New Testament. But yet these layers remain in the Bible, and I think it's a good thing these layers remain in the Bible, because what tends to happen is people with different cultural filters, they tend to light up. Substitutionary atonement lights up for people for whom the demonic stuff is sort of laid aside. And we've seen this often in the more secular frames in recent centuries. Now, Christ as moral example speaks to secularists who are skeptical about God, demonic oppression, and an ability to actually relate, the unbuffered self. The Christian Bible seems to afford all of these readings, and you find them both in the Hebrew Scriptures and in the New Testament. Idols are stock and stone, or idols are fronts for demons. Jesus is the sacrifice of atonement. Jesus is the one able to bind the strong man, and no one can compete. All these multiple images then come through the Bible, and the Bible seems absolutely fine with leaving all of this raw material that people then that different churches and different cultures begin to use to put together a cohesive, practical, working theology that scales and helps people all up and down whole varieties of hierarchies. Now, these tensions get carried down into the Protestant Reformation, and a lot of these tensions, in fact, are in neo-evangelicalism and American evangelicalism, as again, I think Molly Worthen brings out nicely in her book. Catholics persecuted Lutherans and Reformed, and then, of course, well, the Pope was the Antichrist, and Rome was the Antichrist. You have Babylon, which is Rome. The Reformational Christians are reading in this way, and so then the true church are sort of revolutionaries against, and sometimes real political revolutionaries against, the tyranny of Rome. Now, unfortunately for the Anabaptists, Lutherans and Reformed continued to persecute the Anabaptists just like the Roman Catholics did. And so this revolutionary strain really gets deep in Anabaptism. And as Molly Worthen nicely points out, whereas fundamentalists and neo-evangelicals tend to follow along the strain of sort of a rationalistic Calvinism, and even some of the literalism that happened in fundamentalist churches, the literalism that takes off in the Anabaptist tradition tends to be a moral, practical literalism of these are the practices of the Christian church. And you see these distinctions, and of course this gets played on in an interesting way then in the mid to late 20th century and the developments, and that's the history that she writes about. So they emphasize not so much right thinking, but right sort of literalistic behavior. So the Anabaptists would read the Old Testament not necessarily as guides for their theology and how to think, which tends to be very Reformed, but rather guides for how to behave. And so that's where in many ways you get Anabaptist pacifism. And it's interesting in Molly Worthen's book where Anabaptists who are historically informed are always worried about their tradition of pacifism slipping away. And this, in fact, became a very critical thing during the Second World War. And certain Anabaptists rose to sort of say, this is how we can both be good American citizens by being conscientious objectors, and a whole bunch of stuff went from there. But all of this is to say that these revolutionary themes are very deep in certain Protestant, especially in Anabaptist features. So I'm not surprised, Julian, that you react to Pageau in the way that you do. And to a certain degree, same with Nate, and some of this came through in the question and answer with Pageau. Atheists are kind of rationalist Protestant neo-pagans. What do I mean by that? Well, being is neutral, and they use physical power to fashion the world according to good, bad, right, or wrong, and their choices. That's basically what the New Atheist Project was about. And it's in this context that Pageau comes and pushes against it. And he is the apostle of purpose. He is the disciple of order. And this is why a lot of natural law folks, and I don't have to name you, really enjoy Pageau's work, because that comes deeply through. And in fact, his entire project showing via symbolism how reality lays itself out. And what's interesting, and what's so in many ways different from, let's say, a Reformed neo-evangelical tradition that so emphasizes thought, Pageau is basically showing that, well, these things lay themselves out all over the place. It isn't as presuppositional as a lot of Reformed thought. And so, regardless of your presuppositions, Jonathan Pageau wants to show you how the story of the Bible comes to the fore and lays itself out. And we can find it in movies. We can find it in politics. We can find it in nature. We can find it everywhere. This is the structure of creation. And, as John Vervaeke said, I mean, this is a very old and very powerful system. And Jonathan Pageau is bringing this very forcefully into the conversation. Now, again, just because there's lots of ways of manifesting this, I know a lot of Roman Catholics and even some who are not practicing Christians, I won't mention my friend's name, but natural law, and they very much see natural law. Now, the arising of natural law and the framing of that has its own historical element. In my Dutch Calvinist tradition, we tend to prefer the words created order. And so even in my tradition, you can afford Pageau's order within Dutch Calvinism, because that's the created order. And so he's showing the order. Now, people like Stephen Woodford, Rationality Rules, they really struggle. Adam Friended, they really struggle to understand Pageau, because being is good, being is neutral. We've had a lot of time, basically, since the Enlightenment, with increasingly the assertion that being is neutral. And so when Pageau comes showing the order that he's showing, and on one hand saying this is just the way the world lays itself out, but also implying as a Christian that this is a good order, well, in many ways, Pageau is bringing back all of those same tensions that you'll find in the Church Fathers, and the appropriation of Platonism, Neoplatonism, even Aristotle via Aquinas. And all of this stuff is coming back into the conversation via Pageau. And that's why he'll say very clearly, Christianity is not a revolution. Christianity is a restoration. Now, if I say restoration in Protestant frames, there are traditions of Restorationism, Christian Church Disciples of Christ. There's a big movement in the 19th century, these restorationist movements. And in fact, that's been an ongoing theme both within Christianity, but especially within Protestantism. That restorationism is a little bit different from what Pageau is laying out. Pageau is laying out very ancient order and saying, this is how world works. If you live according to this order and this structure, things will go well with you. So in that way, we hear some of these older strains coming out of the Old Testament through Pageau. The king has returned. Get on board. Pattern, 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 pattern. If you follow the patterns and you train your life to be in accordance with the patterns, you will. And now you get into the Orthodox theosis and their program. All of this happens. They don't see it as a revolution, but it's not. It's tougher for an Anabaptist than it is for Dutch Reformed. But I think you can see that this isn't necessarily antithetical by virtue of what the New Testament does. Now, again, you sort of have neo-evangelicals and rationalist Calvinists saying it's right thinking. You have Anabaptists saying it's right living. And you have Orthodox and some Roman Catholics saying it's right liturgy. Those are where some of the tensions come. But again, do you really have to choose? Shouldn't you have right liturgy in the church, right living, and right thinking? Certainly the right liturgy people are doing a lot of work out there in podcasts and on YouTube in terms of teaching thinking. The Orthodox teach thinking. Reformed people talk about right living and regulative principle of worship. You can find that in Reformed and English Reformed visions. And of course, all of these things, all of the traditions have. It's much more a question of emphasis. And to be a little bit more accurate, I think we would say that the church is counter-revolutionary. Again, Jesus restores the kingdom. That's really the frame. And now, depending on a particular tradition's theology of the Old Testament, there are going to be different tensions. And so, for example, Lutherans, it could be a little bit harder. And this is some of the differentiation that Calvin made in the Third Use of the Law from the Lutherans. And when I was talking about Nadia Bolz-Weber, some of why she's a Lutheran and how that comes through, that fits better in some ways with the Lutherans. Now, I'm not looking to pick a fight with Jordan B. Cooper or any Lutherans out there, but these are some of the complexities of the different Protestant traditions and camps. So the church is in many ways counter-revolutionary, even if it seems revolutionary from the perspective of people so embedded in this rebellious world that they can't see the patterns. And in the previous video, I mentioned how the Apostle Paul and his teaching of sexuality, when Tom Holland sees that in the context of Roman paganism, he would easily say that's revolutionary. And we're using that word in a very common way. Now, if you want to correct him, you could say it's really counter-revolutionary from a Jewish perspective, because what it is counter-corruption. And so what Paul is trying to do is restore the created order in terms of how in the garden man and woman were supposed to dwell. And right away I've triggered a whole bunch of Protestant theology, especially Reformed theology, of creation, fall, redemption, restoration, or renewal. And there tends to be a lot of debate about, well, exactly what that fourth R looks like. So, Julian, I don't think you have to choose. I think, now you might want to debate Jonathan Pageau on this, but I think if we're going to try to get it right, I think there's ways to understand Pageau's framing, and I don't think it's so far that Anabaptists won't understand it. So there's my answer to that. Hope it helps.